Congratulations, true crime addicts. We've survived another week. It is Friday, March 10th, 2023. And on today's show, Mexico is no bueno. A new victim claims she was assaulted by Alex Murdaugh. And Brian Laundrie's mother is maybe a fan of literary fiction. Or not. Stay tuned.
Yes, super excited. We are all pumped to have James Renner.
James Renner on.
That James Renner has zeroed in on.
James Renner once again drops a bombshell.
Investigative journalist, reporter James Renner, who's been on the podcast, longtime friend of mine.
All right, let's get on with this show. First of all, I just want to say thank you for tuning in. If you haven't already, subscribe, and that way you get this every morning, every Friday morning, and you'll know the top true crime stories before anybody else in the office does. Not that anybody goes to the office anymore; we're all remote. But yeah, thank you for tuning in. And sorry I wasn't here last week. I took a day off, as they used to say in the factories. I took a my day. Last week, I actually testified at the Ohio State House in support of House Bill 35 here in Ohio, which would get rid of the statute of limitations for boys who were abused in the Boy Scouts. As you may or may not know, the Boy Scouts is currently bankrupt. They went into bankruptcy because so many boys were coming forward with allegations of assault and suing the Boy Scouts, and the only way they could maybe survive is through this bankruptcy. And in Ohio, the statute of limitations is such that a victim who was abused in scouting, say in the 80s, would only be able to recover about $6,000. Now, if we're able to get rid of the statute of limitations with this bill, they could recoup much, much more than that. Now, I am a victim of abuse inside the Boy Scouts, and I will be talking about that in a book that I'm currently writing. Probably won't be out until 2024, though. But I'm not a claimant. I haven't sued the Boy Scouts or anything like that. But I did testify along with 5 other victims last week, and it was intense. It was emotional. So I took a little time off, and it's something I'm beginning to talk about and something I'm writing about. So stay tuned for this book down the road. But yes, I'm happy to be back. Let's get to the top stories for this week. If you're thinking about heading to Mexico for spring break, kiddos, maybe pick another destination. 4 Americans from South Carolina were kidnapped in Mexico last week. 2 were killed, and 2 were found alive on Tuesday. Now, they'd traveled into Mexico seeking cheap health care. Latavia McGee needed a medical procedure down there. 3 others went with her. They were Eric Williams, Shaid Woodard, and Zindell Brown. Last Friday, they drove across the border into Matamoros in a family van. Matamoros is a town across the border. I think they passed through Texas, and it's not far into Mexico either. It's like a 20-minute drive or something like that. So that they had just crossed the border. They're in the family van, and as they were approaching an intersection, their van was hit by another vehicle, and this was captured on video, I think, from nearby stores. So they were hit by another vehicle, which caused them to crash. Somebody began shooting at their van. Then a white pickup truck comes rolling over, and armed men jump out, and they put these 4 Americans in the back of the white pickup truck in the cab there. In the truck's bed. And then they sped away. A 33-year-old Mexican woman was also killed at the scene, according to USA Today. By Sunday, the FBI was involved in the search, and they were offering a $50,000 reward for any information. Then on Tuesday, authorities located the group inside a guarded wooden shack and freed them after overpowering their captors. Unfortunately, Woodard and Brown were already dead. Eric Williams had been shot in the leg. Latavia appears unharmed, thankfully. They were quickly driven back to the United States, escorted by ambulances and armored vehicles. Mexican authorities believe they were mistaken for Haitian drug smugglers by members of a local cartel. Maybe the lesson here, this is something, it's a tragic story all the way around, but what I don't think is being talked about enough is the fact that they had to travel into Mexico to get quality, cheap, I should say, affordable health care. It shouldn't be that expensive, for the United States, for people living here. It shouldn't be so expensive that it forces us to travel into third world countries for common medical procedures. So maybe this is a little bit of a wake-up call for that too, hopefully. But what a crazy story. An interesting bit of info came out this week about the arrest of Bryan Kohberger. Remember Bryan Kohberger? He was, he was arrested for the murders of those 4 students from the University of Idaho: Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Zaina Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. So a little bit of info came out about his arrest this week. Kohberger is 28 years old, looks like Ichabod Crane, and he was working on his PhD in criminology at the time of those murders in November. Police narrowed in on him pretty early on, even though everybody on social media is like, the police aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. Well, yeah, they were. Just give them some time. They tracked him to Pennsylvania when he drove home to hide out at his parents' place. And before the arrest, while he was still there, they did a trash pull to look for DNA in the family's trash. And they did find DNA, but not from Bryan. They found, I believe it was his parents' DNA. They wondered at the time, he's living there. We know he's living there. Why can't we find any of his DNA? Well, and the reason they were looking for DNA is the killer left behind a knife sheath at the scene of the murders, and they found DNA from the killer on that knife sheath. So they had something to compare it to. And so they did their DNA testing, and of course they came back and found that the DNA from that knife sheath connected to the DNA from the family trash pull, but not directly, and close enough to show that it was like a mother-father relationship. So they knew they had enough to get their guy, and that's when they were able to actually bust into the house and arrest Bryan. Now, they did it in the early morning hours of December 30th. When they busted in, they thought everybody was probably sleeping, but turns out Kohberger was actually in the kitchen, and he was wearing latex gloves and putting his personal trash into separate Ziploc bags, according to Fox News. So they think he was actually saving his personal trash and getting rid of it at a different location, and making sure that he wore gloves if he was touching anything that might end up in the family trash. So, not guilty behavior in the least, right? So interesting. He in some ways he seems to try to come off as this super smarter than everybody else killer, and he's going through these lengths to conceal what he's doing. At the same time, he's really stupid, right? He left the knife sheath in. It's a weird dynamic. I'm interested in a profiler that gets to talk to him and kind of picks apart his brain. Also this week, the public defender for Kohberger is asking the judge, I think the courts over there to give them more money so they can hire an additional lawyer to represent Kohberger, because it's just become such a huge case. So that'll be developing for a while. And one final story about convicted killer Alex Murdaugh, a.k.a. Creepy Eyes McGee. This new story came out just this week. A former sex worker has come forward to say that she was beaten and raped by Alex Murdaugh about 8 years ago. Turns out she was hired for a guy's weekend at a beach house at the Isle of Palms. There's this whole weird, elite society that has come out of this story about this legacy of these lawyers and what really goes on behind the scenes in proper Southern civilized society. And it's really quite chilling. Anyways, this sex worker alleges that Murdaugh was there with friends doing shots and cocaine, and that at first he seemed friendly, but when he got her alone, things changed quickly. This is a quote from her during an interview that she gave to Fitz News. Quote, "You could see his whole entire personality change. His eyes were like black in a way." Remember, I'm always talking about his eyes. Sometimes these weird killers get into the situation. It's almost like something from that movie Split, right? Where something about what's broken inside their brain manifests physically. And that is, unless you want to dive deep and believe into things like possession and demons and things like that. But something changes them physically. I'm fascinated by that story. And here she's saying, this victim is saying his eyes changed in the moment. And you hear about that in other stories too. I think somebody said that about Ted Bundy as well. She says he choked her and raped her, pulling out tufts of her hair. Prosecutors chose not to bring that up at trial, though. But the woman was able to identify other men that were at that party 8 years ago. So she seems credible. But hopefully that's the last story we get about Alex Murdaugh, right? So those are the top stories. Hey, I'll be right back. I got to tell you, the Porchlight Project solved another case. And there's several solves in genetic genealogy. And we got to get to the story about Brian Laundrie's mother. So I'll be back in 2 and 2.
Please hang up and try again.
Hi, I'm Alexa Doubt with the Porchlight Project, a new nonprofit dedicated to funding DNA testing and genetic genealogy for cold cases in the state of Ohio. For our first case, we assisted the Cuyahoga Falls Police Department, funding new DNA tests on evidence from the 1987 unsolved murder of 17-year-old Barbara Blatnick. That information was given to expert genealogists who traced the genetic markers to a man named James Zastonic, who was arrested in May of 2020 and charged with Barb's murder. Our goal at the Porchlight Project is to entirely fund 3 to 4 cold case investigations every year. Each new case costs about $6,000 to complete, which is a small price to pay for closure. The Porchlight Project relies on generous donations from the public. Even $5 can help us solve a murder. For more information on how to help, please visit porchlightonline.org.
And we're back with Emergency, starring Randolph Mantooth. Hey, there's some great news for the Porchlight Project, this nonprofit that I started several years ago with Alexa Doubt. But since then, we've got a great board of directors, and we have our own genetic genealogist, a woman named Val Bogart. And I mentioned her because she helped solve this case out of Youngstown just last week. A press conference was held in Youngstown where police announced that the Porchlight Project's genealogist, Val Bogart, identified a John Doe they had been trying to ID since 1987, when a human skull was found off Liberty Road by a couple squirrel hunters. Our friends over at Othram Labs, aka Othram, tested the bones and extracted DNA, then handed the profile over to Porchlight, that's us, where Val tracked it to a family tree and then confirmed with family members that this skull belonged to 23-year-old Robert Earl Sanders, who was reported missing in 1976. Youngstown Police Captain Jason Simon pointed out that it was exactly 17,000 days between Sanders' disappearance and his identification. How strange is that? I'm not sure what it means, but it's interesting, right? Youngstown Police have asked Val to assist them on another case already. More on that soon. I'm very proud of the work the Porchlight Project has done. If you are so inclined, we get by and we're able to do these cases because of donations from people like you. If you're interested, check out porchlightonline.org. Police in northern Kentucky closed a cold case this week thanks to genetic genealogy. 16-year-old Carol Sue Klaber was last seen alive June 4th, 1976, when she got into a car with a man who had sandy blonde hair. Her body was found in a ditch the next day. She'd been sexually assaulted and beaten to death with a tire iron, according to Law and Crime. The killer left his DNA on that tire iron, but the case remained unsolved for decades. Then last year, Kentucky police contacted Othram and had them test the evidence, that was funded by Season of Justice, which is Ashley Flowers' nonprofit. Othram gave them a name, Thomas Dunaway. Unfortunately, Dunaway passed away in 1990, but he'd actually committed another murder 6 months after Carol Sue Klaber killed a man while he was AWOL from the Army, and he served time for that murder but was released in 1984. Police will be Othram will be putting his profile into CODIS to see if perhaps this man matches to any more unsolved crimes in the area. And not to be outdone, genetic genealogist C.C. Moore solved a Jane Doe case in Oregon this week. Everybody was working overtime. A partially skeletonized? Let's try that. Body was found in a remote area near Sweet Home, Oregon, in April 2020, according to commonnews.com. The remains appeared to be female. Police sent one of the teeth to DNA Labs International, and the genealogy work was done at Parabon Nanolabs, where C.C. Moore works. They were able to trace the genetic data to a family tree of one Grace Lorna Narvaez Weaver, who was reported missing in Washington about a year before the bones were found in Oregon. Now, just like with most John and Jane Doe cases, this is the first half of the story. The investigation continues into her death. She was last seen with an unknown male planning a trip to California. This is the golden age of cold case solves, people, and we're living right in it, and I get to report on it. It's a good time. It's a good time for true crime. I got a little bit of weird news for you. I like to throw something a little weird in there that I find on the wire, as they say. So here it is. An affidavit was filed in court this week, and it revealed a weird letter that Brian Laundrie's mother sent to her son. The letter was marked, quote, "burn after reading," and contained mention of burying a body. Brian Laundrie murdered Gabby Petito last year and then hid out at his parents' house before sneaking away to kill himself. Gabby's parents are suing Brian's parents in civil court right now, alleging that the Laundries helped to conceal their daughter's murder. This letter does not look good. But this week, Brian's mother says the letter is not what it looks like, and that she was only talking about a book that was called Burn After Reading, which she said Gabby had given to her son before the murder. And if you believe that, I have a bridge in Brooklyn I'd love to sell you. Write to me at jamesrenner.com. Over to pop culture. I am obsessed again with MH370 on Hulu, the Malaysian airliner that disappeared. I'm back into it full force. It's a really good documentary. It's a 3-parter. If you haven't seen it yet, check it out. It's worth your time. So there's some things in there that I'd either completely forgotten about or I'd never heard before. The most chilling thing that came out in that first episode is that after the plane went missing, they gathered all the family members at that hotel, remember? And they're sitting around waiting for more news. And they started calling their relatives who were on this flight that had disappeared. And the cell phones were connecting. They would just ring. They wouldn't go, instead of going straight to voicemail, right? Like if something were to blow up or if the phone was dead, they actually connected, but nobody picked up. And there's a claim in there, they present it as if it's true, that this woman received a call from her father who was on that flight while they're in this hotel. And she's showing people as it's ringing. She's freaked out. She's like, oh my God, it's my dad. And they're like, answer it, answer it. And she goes to answer it and it disconnects. So what the hell was that about? Anyways, I've never been a fan of the suicide theory. Something about it. I'm no expert in psychology, but something about it doesn't ring true. I think the answer is gonna be weird. Not like paranormal weird, but like, I don't know, something with the Chinese or Kazakhstan, something weird. But don't quote me on it. Hey, now let's check out a true crime book this week. I always have a new one on the shelf. This one was sent to me this week. New book called Sorry, let me take a drink of this. I got Diet Coke going right now. Disequilibria, Meditations on Missingness. Meta true crime, if you will. Here's the write-up. What happens to a family when a loved one goes missing? How do they recover from that loss over time? Or do they ever? Robert Laundrie takes an intimate look at these questions and more in this book, a hybrid memoir that recounts the 1982 disappearance of the author's stepfather, James Edward Lewis, a pilot and Vietnam vet. Recounting his family's experience in searching for answers, Laundrie interrogates the broader cultural and conceptual responses to the phenomenon of missingness by connecting his stepfather's case to other true-life disappearances, as well as those portrayed in fiction, poetry, and film. In doing so, Disequilibria deftly explores the inherent transience of modern life, particularly by considering the military-dependent experience, the corrosive effects of war on soldiers and their families, and how people struggle to find closure and comfort as time goes by without answers. You know, I've talked to many families of missing people. That is the hardest part, the not knowing, the not understanding. My favorite show is The Leftovers, which is all about that theme. It's something that is entirely inhuman, and nobody should have to go through that. So I'm interested. I'm going to read this one, Disequilibria. Check it out. That's the show for this week, man. It's over. And now we're into the weekend, which is always good news and reason to celebrate. And in the words of the incomparable Murray Saul, the godfather of Cleveland radio, that means it's time we gotta get down. Damn it. True Crime This Week is a Fearful Symmetry production. Photo and artwork are licensed through Shutterstock. If you like the cut of my jib, I have another podcast you might enjoy called The Philosophy of Crime, in which I attempt to solve the big questions behind our true crime obsession by looking to philosophy for answers. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week. Sit, Brownie, sit. Good dog.